We've been sort of systematically on a journey this fall. If you haven't been able to pay attention to the big themes, we did a couple of introductory sessions on what is Catholicism. Then we began to look at the mystery of the human person, the great questions that we all ask: where do we come from, where are we going, what's wrong with us, what's the solution, etc., why are we here? We looked at the mystery of God. So how does God reveal God's self to humanity? And I focused in a very pivotal way on the original manifestation of God near Mount Horeb when Moses first encountered God in a bush that was on fire but was not consumed. And in the meantime, we've also taken a few sidelines. We did a tour of the church. We did a walk through the Mass. And we've also done sort of an introductory session on how Catholics look at and understand Scripture. So aside from those kind of sidebars, if you follow the movement of thought, and we looked at the mystery of God several weeks ago now, tonight we move to the person of Jesus. And I think it's hard to underestimate how important the figure of Jesus is to someone who is going to be a Catholic Christian. So Christ is the center of the Christian faith, thus the name Christianity. So it gets its very name from Jesus being the Christ. We're going to be looking tonight at the person of Jesus and how he affected human beings around him, and a little bit of background about his life. I think it's fair to say, though, that of all the persons that have ever lived in human history, there has been no figure in human history that has so impacted world history as Jesus of Nazareth. I think that would be a fair statement to make. So much so that the vast majority of the world to this day still divides time around the birth of Jesus. So whether you call it before Christ or the common era, in the year of our Lord, or the common era, that dividing point in human history is the great marker of time for most of the globe these days. It doesn't mean there are not other calendars, but that's become the predominant one. So, who is this Jesus of Nazareth, and why has he had such an impact? Remember, he was never elected to any political office. He never led any troops into battle. He never wrote a book that he left behind. So those are often markers of people who are well-known or successful. So it's even more surprising that he is the figure that he is. And tonight I want to take you to one of the what I call the pivotal scenes in the Gospels. So we're going to talk a bit more about the four Gospels and their connection with each other. But to this day, the four Gospels that we have in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are still the best sources of information that we have about Jesus. There are so-called Gnostic Gospels from the 2nd century, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and others like it, that most scholars clearly regard as dependent upon the four main canonical Gospels. So if you want to know something about Jesus, eventually you're going to have to encounter Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So most modern biblical critical scholars believe that Mark was the first one of the four to be written. It is the shortest of all the Gospels. It presents the most unvarnished picture of Jesus. And so we're going to start tonight with that Gospel of Mark. And I think Mark is always trying to answer two basic questions. Number one, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? And secondly, what does it mean to follow him? So if you read, how many of y'all got to go to the Gospel of Mark on Saturday night? So when you experience that Gospel unfolding in one evening like that, it really becomes clear that, first of all, the impact that Jesus had, profound impact on people around him. When you read the Gospel, there are 13 major healings that out Saturday night. And as the priest mentioned, almost every single part of the human body is healed over the course of those 13 healings. From a stooped back to a withered hand to paralyzed legs to eyes and ears, mouth, and so forth. So the whole human person gets to experience in the Gospel of Mark profound healing in its encounter with the figure of Jesus. So Mark is going to try to answer that question, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? And I want to take you to what I call the hinge narrative in Mark's Gospel. We're about halfway through chapter 8, verse 27. Then Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples this question, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some, John the Baptizer, others, Elijah, still others, one of the prophets." "And you," he went on to ask them, "who do you say that I am?" So for Mark, that question is pivotal. So until now, the disciples of Jesus have been accompanying him. They've experienced some very profound healings and miracles, powerful moments on the lake when Jesus stills the storm. And they ask the question, who can this be? But even wind and sea obey him. And now Jesus will ask the question directly of them. Who do you say that I am? And I would propose to you that all of us have to answer that question at some point in life. Who do we say that Jesus is for us? Now, what's the answer? Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." Our Messiah in English is just the translation of the Hebrew word Rcia. So it means one who is anointed, presumably with oil. The Greek word Christos, which we translate in English as Christ, means the same thing in Greek. So when you hear Jesus is Christ, Jesus is Messiah, it means he is anointed. Now what does that mean? What does it mean to be anointed with oil? Well, you have to understand something of the Old Testament to understand what it is to be anointed. So in the Old Testament, when God wanted to choose someone to do something very significant, God would have that person anointed with oil. The most common example would be what? Who gets anointed in the Old Testament?
Kings.
Oh, the kings, yes, the kings. Yeah, so when King David is chosen to be king of Israel, instead of, in the medieval period, of course, they used crowns, but in the Old Testament, oil was poured over his head. So that's how God chose David to be king. He anointed him king of Israel. Second group of people that got anointed in the Old Testament are the priests who offer sacrifice. So they got anointed with oil. And prophets are sometimes spoken of as anointed by God. So Isaiah the prophet says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor." In fact, Jesus will quote that very passage from Isaiah in Luke's Gospel in speaking about the beginning of his own ministry. So anyone who said to Jesus, "You are the anointed one, you're the Messiah, the Christ," in the first century would know that they're meaning by that, this person has been chosen by God for some very unique purpose, a distinctive role. In the case of Jesus of Nazareth, what do you think Simon Peter meant when he said in Mark's Gospel, "You are the Messiah, the anointed one"? Well, let's read on. Then Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them. Now listen to Jesus' own self-description. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man had to suffer much, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, be put to death, and rise 3 days later. He said these things quite openly. Peter then took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this he turned around and eyeing the disciples, rebuked Peter. "Get out of my sight, you Satan. You are not judging by God's standards, but by human standards." So Jesus, in answer to Peter identifying him as Christ the Messiah or the Anointed One, provides Jesus with an opportunity to say to Peter, "The Son of Man," that's me, the human one, "I'm going to Jerusalem, but I'm not going there to be the king. I'm not going to be in glory like David was king. In fact, the Son of Man is going to suffer and die and be put to death and rise on the third day." Was this what Peter imagined? Absolutely not. He thought of Jesus probably as a king like David. You're going to come into the city, you're going to lead us, you're going to restore the tribes, you're going to be the victor. And when Jesus presents the opposite portrait for Simon, Simon doesn't want that to happen. So he rebukes Jesus, and Jesus in turn rebukes Peter. "You're tempting me, you're a Satan." That's what the word Satan means, a tempter. "So get behind me, follow me to Jerusalem." So in Mark's gospel, Simon Peter is the only one up until this point who is not possessed by demons, who recognizes that Jesus is the Anointed One of God, but he doesn't really understand what it means. Now, I'll also add, this invites Jesus to give a little explanation about how you have to take up your cross and follow in my footsteps and so forth. This little section of Mark's gospel, by the way, is Jesus is teaching the disciples about what's going to happen to him and what it means to follow him. And he goes into a second little explanation that the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men who will put him to death. So a second time, he will predict his passion. What's the response on the part of the disciples after that second prediction? Anybody know? The second response, they returned to Capernaum, and Jesus, once inside the house, began to ask them, "What were you discussing on the way?" At this they fell silent, for on the way they had been arguing about which one of them was the most important. So isn't that interesting? Simon Peter says, "You're you're going to be the king. The Son of Man is going to suffer and die, Peter." The second time he tells them he's going to suffer and die, they're quietly arguing about which one of them is most important. And that inspires Jesus, by the way, to take a little child, place the child in their midst and say, if you become little, like this little child, you get it. It's not about being important like the world thinks of importance. Jesus will go on to a third prediction. A third time he tells them, the Son of Man is going to be put to death, and it's in more detail. He'll be flogged. The Gentiles will spit on him, and finally kill him, but 3 days later he will rise. Anybody know how the disciples respond the third time? James and John, "Teacher, we have a request." "What is it?" he asked. "See to it that when you come into your glory, we sit one at your right and one at your left." So they're waiting for him to get to Jerusalem so they can sit in glory with him. And then Jesus asked the question, "Can you be baptized? Like I'm going to be baptized? Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink?" And they don't understand he's speaking about the cup of suffering, the baptism of death on the cross. And of course they're very eager. "We can." And he rightly points out, "You will, but this is not what life is about." The other 10 get indignant about it. And again, Jesus has to say, the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So this section of Mark's gospel, we get 3 predictions that Jesus is going to die every single time, but those closest followers of his will misunderstand and want to be important instead. So it's a reminder for all of us, isn't it? I think. Now, if you expand out a little bit, right before this little section of Mark's gospel, there's a blind man who is brought to Jesus by somebody else. And Jesus is trying to heal the guy, but the guy can't see very well. The first time Jesus tries to heal him, he says, I can see people, but they look like trees. So actually Jesus has to work a little harder to heal his blindness. So what is that blindness all about? Who can't see in the gospel? It's Simon Peter and the 12. They don't see who Jesus really is or what it means. He's trying to clear their vision up. It's interesting that after those three predictions, there's another blind man who will be healed by the name of Bartimaeus. But nobody has to bring Bartimaeus to Jesus to be healed. He cries out for help himself, and he says, Lord, I want to see. And immediately his sight is given to him. And what does Mark tell us? He follows Jesus on the road up to Jerusalem. So Bartimaeus has been given the gift of sight. He sees after the three predictions of the Passion. So if I ask you a question, for the Gospel of Mark, is the fact that Jesus is anointed by God, the Messiah or Christ, is that the most important thing about Jesus? There's something more important about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, as important as that is. By the way, for a moment, I want you to think about what it would have been like to be there in the first century. What if you were living along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and you had grown up in your ancient faith of Israel that had been going on for over 1,000 years, and you meet this itinerant, this wandering preacher on the shore of the sea? What would you have thought of this man making these claims? People responded all across the board. Some believed. Some rejected him and wanted to put him to death. It wasn't quite so obvious to those who first met Jesus. We have the blessing of being able to look back 2,000 years in hindsight at everything we know that we developed in terms of the teaching of the church and the Gospels. But can you imagine what it would have been like to meet Jesus for the first time? By the way, you would have known he was human because he would have been eating and breathing and walking and coughing and hugging and touching and doing all the things that human beings do. So you wouldn't have to be convinced that he was human, but you might begin to wonder, he seems to be more than an ordinary person. What's going on with this figure? Why is he different? That's why Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? Well, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answers the question. Anybody know what's more important for Mark than the Messiah? Well, let's go back. I should tell you to bring your Gospels, by the way, your Bibles. If you go back to the beginning of Mark's Gospel, it's the opening scene where we first meet Jesus. Listen, during that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. So in the Gospel of Mark, we meet Jesus for the first time down in the Jordan River being baptized by John. Immediately on coming up out of the water, he, that is Jesus, saw the sky rent in two and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Then a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. On you my favor rests." So what do we know about Jesus from that first moment in the Gospel of Mark, first time we meet him? The hero of the Gospel. What does the Father, what does God say about him? You're my Son. So Jesus is the Son of God. You are my beloved Son, on you my favor rests. Notice in the Gospel of Mark, by the way Mark writes the story, this is not something that is addressed to the crowd. It's not like it is in later Gospels. This is my beloved Son. I'm well pleased in him. It's you are my beloved Son. Mark presents it as something that Jesus experiences, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone else gets it. In fact, it's very interesting that when you go through the Gospel of Mark, there is no other person in the Gospel that will say to Jesus, you are the Son of God, unless they're possessed by demons. So the demons, the world of darkness, know the identity of Jesus, but humanity is in the dark. They don't get it yet. So, significant moment. When is the next time that we hear something about Jesus being the Son of God? It's interesting, but it happens right after Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And this is 6 days later after that question. By the way, what's so important about Caesarea Philippi? Well, Caesarea Philippi, when you are in the Holy Land, is about as far north as Jesus will get away from Jerusalem. So he's as far away almost as he gets, where you have a public scene described in this gospel. And he's gone, if you go to the north side of the Sea of Galilee where Capernaum is, and you follow the Jordan River all the way up to the base of Mount Hermon, that's where the springs of Caesarea Philippi are. And it was at the base of that rock cliff that the Romans had shrines to Roman gods there. So Jesus is going to a place where there are Roman gods portrayed, to a place where there's big giant rocks everywhere, and that's where he asked them the question, who do you say that I am? When Peter says you're the anointed one, Jesus turns and they start heading south, back to Jerusalem. So they arrived 6 days later, and Jesus took only 3, Peter, James, and John, off by themselves with him, and led them up a high mountain. He was transfigured before their eyes, and his clothes became dazzlingly white, whiter than the work of any bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them along with Moses. The two were in conversation with Jesus. Then Peter spoke to Jesus, Rabbi, how good it is for us to be here, and so forth and so on. A cloud came, overshadowed them, and out of the cloud a voice came. This is my Son. Listen to him, my beloved. Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, only Jesus. So on the Mount of Transfiguration, after Simon Peter has said, you're the Messiah, the Father says, this is my Son. Now, this is really a trick question. You can't answer it if you've heard me talk about this before. So, who is the first person in the Gospel of Mark who will finally recognize that Jesus is the Son of God and say, truly this man was the Son of God, not possessed by a demon? Not John the Baptist. Good guess.
Was it the Roman soldier?
It was the Roman centurion at the moment Jesus dies on the cross. Nobody in the entire Gospel of Mark who's not possessed recognizes the real identity of Jesus until he's dying on the cross. In fact, we go to chapter 14. When noon came, darkness fell on the whole countryside and lasted until mid-afternoon. At that time Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Gospel of Mark, by the way, that's the only thing Jesus will say on the cross. Then uttering a loud cry, he breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The centurion, so that's the Roman soldier who was guarding Jesus at the cross, who stood guard over him, on seeing the manner of his death, declared, clearly, this man was the Son of God. It's powerful, isn't it? None of the 12 recognize, but when he sees the way Jesus dies, he sees that he is the Son of God. What's Mark trying to tell us by writing his gospel this way? He's a narrative, or we call him a narrative theologian. I think he's trying to tell us that we don't really understand what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God apart from the cross. Because only when he gives himself fully for us and dying for us that we really understand his true identity. This is what it means to be anointed by God or chosen. This is what it means for him to be the Son of God. So for Mark, it's a very, the theology of Mark is focused on the cross, at that moment of Jesus' utter desolation and giving up of his spirit for us. It's interesting, the original ending to the Gospel of Mark is also kind of cryptic. So if you came on Saturday evening, it's Easter Sunday morning. When the Sabbath was over, by the way, who shows up? Mary Magdalene. Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought perfumed oils with which they intended to go and anoint Jesus. So what does Mark tell us in his Gospel? The 12 that he had chosen to accompany him, one of them betrayed him. One of them denied that he knew him. All of them, at the moment of his arrest, abandoned him. So in Mark's Gospel, there are no men who are standing at the foot of the cross. It's only the women who stand at the cross, looking on from a distance. They see where he dies. They see where they bury his body. And it's the same women who go on Easter Sunday morning to anoint the body of Jesus for burial. Very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the stone had been rolled back. It was a huge one. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. A young man in a white robe. When was the last time there was a young man in a white robe in Mark's Gospel? It's not on the mountain. That was a great guess, though. It was in the garden when he's arrested. There was a young man in the garden who they tried to grab, and he runs off naked. He leaves behind his white garment, his white cloth, runs away. A young man. It's the same word in Greek. And now we have a young man after he's risen, clothed in a white cloth, sitting on the tomb. What's that white robe about? Maybe, one guess, maybe it's the baptismal garment of the Christian. And at the moment Jesus is arrested, the Christians have fled and left their baptismal garment behind. But it's only when he's risen that they are clothed in the garment that is Christ. Well, that's an aside. Then this frightened the women thoroughly, but he reassured them, "You need not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has been raised from the dead. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." Now listen to the women, or to this young man. "Go now and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." When did Jesus tell them he was going to see them in Galilee? It happens at the Last Supper in Mark's Gospel. He says, "After I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." So that's what the Lord promised them at the Last Supper. The angel of the young man here repeats it. Do we have any visit of a risen Jesus to the disciples in Galilee? Ever heard of one of those? Anybody recall one of those? Not Emmaus, that's sort of on the way outside Jerusalem. They're on the sea fishing, John 21, and the risen Lord is standing on the edge of the seashore, and they don't recognize him right away. There's a charcoal fire burning, and finally the beloved disciple recognizes it's Jesus, and he jumps in the water and runs to him. So some scholars think, well, maybe the 12 went back to Galilee, went back to fishing, and that's where the risen Lord first met them. So, but anyway, but they want the women to go and say this to Peter and the others. They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling. Because of their great fear, they said nothing to anyone. ... That's the way the oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end. So they run out of the tomb, they're afraid, they don't say anything to anybody. That's an interesting way to end the gospel, isn't it? Why do you think they ended the gospel that way? Fear. Many people believe that the Gospel of Mark was written in the mid to late 60s AD in the city of Rome. Anybody know what happened in Rome? The Emperor Nero, there had been a big fire in the city of Rome, blamed the Christians for the fire, and the first Christians were put to death there. Peter and Paul, the two leaders of the church, were among those martyred, and the other first Roman martyrs. So the church, the Christian community now is in much fear. Do we still proclaim the gospel in the face of this kind of terror that faces us as a community? So Mark may have left this gospel incomplete at this point, waiting for the hearers of the gospel to say, are we going to be too afraid to go out and tell the good news now? Or, they know what happened, of course, or will we be like the faithful women who went and proclaimed the gospel of the resurrection to Peter and the other members of the 11? So Mark may have left that intentionally unfinished. So if you came on Saturday night, you may have experienced a little of that unfinished state as the gospel ended in the evening. So, all right, so I think Mark in his gospel gives us a good introduction to the person of Jesus. You learn quite a lot about him in this gospel in a narrative form. You learn that he is the beloved Son of the Father, and you can only recognize the fullness of the depths of that when he gives his life on the cross. And in fact, some people have called the Gospel of Mark a passion narrative with an extended introduction. And in a sense, the shadow of the cross marks the entire gospel. And when you get to Matthew and Luke, who probably had a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of them when they wrote their Gospels, they will expand but not lose that core narrative from the Gospel of Mark. All right, any questions or observations at this point? All right, let's consider for a moment how we got Gospels and sort of the sequence of the Gospels. So Jesus was born somewhere around 4 to 6 BC in Bethlehem of Judea. However, he spent most of his life in the village of Nazareth, which probably had a few hundred people in the first century. 3 to 4 to 500 people lived in the village of Nazareth at that point. When you think about that size of a village, what does that tell you about how Jesus grew up? Every single person in the village knew him very well, would have known Mary, would have known the other relatives of Jesus that the Gospels speak about as his brothers and sisters, about the carpenter, Joseph, who was believed to be his father. So he worked a hard job. Tekton, I think, is the Greek word. It's a shaper of stone or of wood. There was a lot more stone in Israel than there is wood, so they probably did a lot of building on stone. Joseph and Jesus, he probably learned that trade from Joseph. Whoever those relatives are described in the New Testament, he lived under a roof with an extended family, which was very common in the first century. Mary, his mother, probably had a profound shaping influence upon him, and certainly the great Jewish faith would have shaped him immensely. So there would have been a place that the local Jewish community would have gathered, a synagogue, where they would have studied the law of God, and Jesus knew the scriptures inside out. You see that in the Gospels. He quotes freely. With the quote we heard from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" is the beginning of a psalm of lament, which ends with trust in God. So Jesus would have been shaped by the prayers of the people of Israel and would have grown up as a worker. It's significant that the public ministry of Jesus that we hear about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at most would have been a 1 to 3 year window of time. If you just took Matthew, Mark, and Luke alone, you might think it was a year because he only goes to Jerusalem once for the Passover. But John tells us about 3 visits to Jerusalem for the Passover. So the traditional length of the public ministry of Jesus is around 3 years. He died roughly when he was about 33 or so years old. The traditional date is 33. Which tells you, by the way, that the vast majority of his life on earth, almost 27, 28, 29, 30 plus years, he lived a quiet, unhumbled, unassuming life where he was almost slipped by unrecognized for who he was. How do we know that? Because we have a gospel story where he will go back to his hometown of Nazareth, and the people ask the question, where did he get all this? You know, we know who he is. His father's the carpenter. You know, we know his family. You know, who does he think he is? And they take offense at him. So, however he lived those first 30 years of life in Nazareth, in that small village where he was so well known, he must have lived such an ordinary, humble human life like everybody else that no one recognized what would later be manifested from the baptism in the Jordan onward to the cross itself. So I think that's very significant. Once he is baptized by John, the Spirit of God in Mark's Gospel will drive him into the Judean desert, the wilderness. If you go down to the Jordan River where he was baptized, it's very hot and dry and desert-like, and that desert is like the American Southwest in the summer. It's a hot, dry, rocky place. And so he spent 40 days in that wilderness alone after that baptismal moment. And the enemy, by the way, in Matthew and Luke, we hear a 3-part temptation. The enemy will attempt to undermine his awareness of his sonship. If you really are the Son of God, then turn these rocks into bread. So if you really are, is an attempt to undermine Jesus' sense. Mark doesn't give us, by the way, a full description of those temptations. It just says that Jesus was tested in the desert and surrounded by wild animals and ministered to by angels. So when you think about that, to be with wild animals, what's that about? Are the wild animals the dangers out there that threaten human existence? Or are they like the animals that Adam knew in Eden? Is Jesus among creation and then the angels? And is it in that place that he is tempted? Mark has the Spirit drive Jesus out into that wilderness. Luke is more gentle. He leads Jesus. The Spirit leads Jesus into the desert. So he arrives back in Galilee, and he does not at first go back to Nazareth where he grew up, but he goes to a city on the north side of the Sea of Galilee called Capernaum. When you read the 4 Gospels, by the way, except for John is very different, there is a section of that Sea of Galilee, it's the northwestern section of the Sea of Galilee that they call the Sacred Ark, because it's the place where almost all the events that take place in the Gospels took place, between Magdala up to Bethsaida. So it's not that big of a space. You can walk around it fairly easily, actually. So things are a lot closer together than we sometimes picture them being when we just hear the gospel Sunday after Sunday. And it's there that he begins to proclaim that the kingdom of God has arrived. And that's basically the message of Jesus in a nutshell. The reign of God is at hand. What does that mean on our part? We have to change our minds. We have to repent. And we have to believe the good news. That's kind of the heart of everything Jesus is saying. The kingdom, the reign is at hand. God is going to rule now. And you have to change your mind. In a sense, you're going to see with new eyes. Believe this good news. So God is doing something incredible here. And then Jesus immediately begins to manifest that powerful goodness. How does he manifest it? He speaks in a way that they've never heard before. He doesn't talk like the other teachers. but he speaks with authority, not like the scribes and Pharisees. Where does this man have such power? And he sees this man who is possessed in the synagogue, and by a word, his power of his word, he sets this man free from the world of darkness. So in the Gospel of Mark, there's this great conflict between the forces of darkness that have enslaved humanity, a legion of demons that would keep us disintegrated apart from God, who cry out, "We know who you are, you're the Son of God," and you have the quiet figure of Jesus. What does he say to the man in the synagogue? Quiet, be still, come out of him. So there's a power, the word of Jesus itself has power. Jesus will say the same thing to the storm on the sea. Quiet, peace, be still, and the storm becomes calm. So the Son of Man, who has come to serve, has within him the power to proclaim the kingdom in such a way that human beings are made whole and restored again. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the poor have the good news preached to them, the dead are raised. So something is happening. The reign of God is dawning, and humanity is being transformed by that dawning reign. Sins are forgiven. And that, by the way, creates a great scandal. You know, who do you think you are? God alone can forgive sins. What's it implying about Jesus' power? That he has the ability to forgive sins that God alone has. So that's the question. Why Jesus asked the question, who do people say that the Son of Man is? So we're entering into the narrative structure of the Gospel of Mark. By the way, does Jesus tell us anywhere in the Gospel of Mark what the meaning of his death will be for us? He predicts it 3 times. Does he tell us the significance of his death beforehand? I know you will know which, because we already did this class, right? The very evening before he died, when he took the bread, he said, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins." He's telling us the evening before it shall happen, the significance of his death as one given, poured out for forgiveness. All right, so how did we get from Jesus of Nazareth, who lived from 4 to 6 BC to about 30 AD, to the first Gospel of Mark, which was written somewhere around the year 70 AD? What was happening in those 40 years between the death of Jesus and his resurrection and the writing of the Gospel of Mark?
The apostles were out preaching.
All right, the apostles were out preaching. They were sharing the good news of Jesus by word of mouth. So that's the great period of quick proclamation of the gospel by word of mouth. Mark has the distinction of probably being the first one who will put the thing down in a continuous written narrative. When he builds his gospel leading to the cross, all the little stories that lead up to it, I like to call them pearls, because each story in its own way, when you read the gospel, is like a little self-contained narrative. A man ran up to Jesus and knelt down before him. He healed him and go and don't tell anybody about this. The story could stand alone by itself. Each little pearl is a story, and Mark threads them together in his gospel. By the way, isn't that the way we remember things anyway? If you think about how our minds work in oral tradition. I always tell the story when I was a kid. Myself and my 2 brothers were taken by my grandmother to Lawrenceburg to the square to go shopping. And we got into a fight and began to chase each other around the car, and my grandmother couldn't catch us. And she got more and more angry trying to get me and my brothers to sit still. And when she finally got us into the car, she said, "I'm going to make you go to the convent and tell sister what you did." we begged her, no, please don't make us do that, Grandma. She drove us to the convent. We had to ring the doorbell. We were saved because Sister wasn't at the convent that day. I remember that story like it happened yesterday. And I probably was 7 years old, or 6 or something. All right, so I remember running around the car. I remember everything that happened from that point, and my grandma yelling all the way to the convent and Sister not being there. I don't remember anything that happened before that day or anything that happened after that day. Why? That's the way memory works. We remember a significant event because it has a key meaning attached to it. So I did learn, by the way, so this is when you talk about how gospels develop over time, how could you get later information? Well, we've told that story as myself and my brothers for the last 40 years as we've grown up. And one day, about 5 years ago, we're at the Christmas dinner table retelling that story, and my mother added something none of us ever remembered. She said, you know, I couldn't leave you with Grandma after that alone because she couldn't handle you. So we learned something new that we had not known before. So it came into the Beckman tradition a little later in the development. So the same thing happened with the gospel. So Mark will give us some core narratives, but once in a while when Matthew or Luke tell the same story, they begin to add in details that we didn't have in Mark. So is that because there was a separate tradition that got handed down that they knew about? Or sometimes Matthew and Luke being a little theologically creative, or we all remember stories a little differently and we retell them slightly differently? Is the retelling, does it shape a bit? Also remember that the stories are being handed down in the church, so they're being proclaimed for a particular reason, and that will shape how they get formed at the same time. The other thing that will happen with these stories is that they will be associated with very specific localities. Think for a moment about the widow of Nain. Jesus comes to Nain with the 12. This widow is walking out, and she only has one child. Her husband is dead, and he's dead. And that's when Jesus intervenes and raises her only son from the dead. So that little story, as a self-contained unit, you can imagine that the people in Nain never forgot what happened and handed that story on during that 40-year window of time until Mark got that story from somebody. So you have this construction of Mark's narrative some 40 years down the road with a material that's been handed down by word of mouth over that 40-year window of time. While preaching is going on, teaching is going on, the sharing of the Eucharist is going on. And next week, we're going to look at how Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark and incorporated some other teachings that Mark doesn't have in his Gospel. But I think we've done probably enough for tonight. We're looking a little sleepy, so we're an hour later than we used to be, so I'm really already your tables and break those questions. So.